Okay, so yes, part 3 of Judges. Our judge today is Gideon. We are in chapters 6 to 8. Okay. All right, so you may know people from your life who are a little bit arrogant, right? Arrogance is a common characteristics of different people, and it's defined simply as an exaggerated sense of importance or ability. So it's the key word is exaggerated, right? And it's often a cover for insecurities. Right? It's a lot of times when you see somebody and meet someone who's really arrogant, they are actually really insecure, but they want to kind of project this exaggerated sense of their abilities and their importance because they don't want you to see their insecurity. And so this is different from confidence, where confidence is not exaggerated. And in confidence, the root is humility and not fear. A confident person is very much aware of their limitations, and they're okay with it. They know this is as good as I've got in this area. That's all right, and they're confident in what they're able to do, while the arrogant person is insecure. They're fearful of it, and so they want to project that like strength that's often exaggerated. Okay? So confident people aren't afraid of their limitations. Today's judge, again, is Gideon. Gideon is a poster child for someone who is insecure, and that leads to arrogance. Okay? And so let's find out what happens. To quickly review, remember the theme in the book of Judges is repeated cycles. The Israelites disobey God. God uses and allows some kind of foreign power to oppress the Israelites. The Israelites then cry out to God, and then God sends a judge who is not like a legal judge, but more of a military commander, a judge to save them and deliver them. And then let's just repeat, because while the judge is there and he's doing his thing, Israel has peace, and over time they forget about God, they disobey, and it just goes over and over in that repeated cycle. That is basically the book of Judges. And so we're in chapters 6 to 8. Let's go through each chapter and kind of figure out what's going on and what does this mean for us. So in chapter 6, the Lord calls Gideon. Okay, so we're in another place where now the people have forgotten. And so in verses 1 to 6, basically we find out the oppressor here are the Midianites, among others, right? They're mainly the Midianites. Remember, when people oppress another, they usually kind of gang up on them. So it's like, okay, there's other groups as well, but you got mainly your Midianites. And they would come in to the land and take the Israelites' crops during harvest time and their herds. And so the Israelites, obviously, in that time, that's your livelihood, right? Things got so bad that the Israelites would actually hide and live in the hills and mountains and the caves when this happened. So they actually had kind of like their homes, but then they had this like ready shelter fort kind of things. So when the Midianites came, they all kind of just went up there and hid and just kind of said, well, I hope they don't take everything, just everything. And then, that's the repeated cycle, okay? And so then we found out, and this is what we read earlier in verse 7 to 10, God actually sends a prophet. This is actually different. Most of the time, it doesn't say that God sends a prophet, God sends a judge, but God sends a prophet this time who comes and basically just reminds people of what has happened. They're like, hey, God has done all these things. All the way from Egypt, God has done this, saved you, was been faithful to you, and you have forgotten and disobeyed the Lord. And so the prophet reminds them of this. And then, but the interesting thing is, it's like, okay, but yet, as the people cry out, God still sends them a deliverer right here. It's Gideon. We see that in verse 16 later. And so there's this reminder of, remember what God has done. Remember how you have not obeyed, and yet God is still patient and God is still loving, and God is still faithful, and he sends you a deliverer, right? And so in verses 11 to 23, now we get to the like Gideon being called. And here's some fun things in here. Okay, so this one, this first part, it's important, but maybe like not like pertinent to the central theme, but it's really neat. Okay, here we see both God and the angel of the Lord. Remember, when you see in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the angel of the Lord, not just an angel, but the angel of the Lord, we understand that to be the pre-incarnate Jesus. That means this is Jesus before he becomes a little baby and a human, right? Because remember, Jesus is not a created being. It's not like there was God and God's like, oh, I'm going to create Jesus and the Holy Spirit. That is not what we believe, right? That's not what's going on. Jesus existed with God in the beginning, right? And so we here see both God and Jesus. And how do we know this? It's because there's this part where Gideon is talking with the angel of the Lord, and he says, hey, let me like make you this offering, okay? And this is really cool. In verse 21 to 23, it says, then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread with the tip of the staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread, and the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. Right? But the Lord said to him, peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die. And so you have this, it's kind of like subtle, right? It's like, he sees the angel of the Lord, and he's like, oh my goodness, the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord disappears, and then God says, don't be afraid. So there's this like, in this conversation, you have both God the Father and the angel of the Lord, which is Jesus, right? Again, we're not like going deep into this, but that's just really cool, because in the Old Testament, you see two parts of the Trinity, right? And I think that's cool. You should think that's cool too. But anyways, okay, so that's that. But here, right from the beginning, right from in the initial part where God calls Gideon, we see his fear and doubt, right from the beginning, right? So we see his fear in verse 11, where he says, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites, right? And so remember, the Midianites, they come in and they just take everything. And so Gideon here is not just threshing wheat in a normal place, which is going to be kind of out in the open, or he's kind of like hiding, right? Because he knows he's scared of the Midianites, and so he's hiding it, hoping he can kind of get some of his wheat done, and then store it away in a cave somewhere, right? So right from the beginning, you see Gideon is a very fearful person. Of course, this fear is not unique, right? I mean, all of the Israelites are really scared at this time because of the Midianites, but he has this fear. We also see a lot of doubt, right? In verse 13 says, Gideon says, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us. When we read this, a lot of times, most people don't like to read out loud. And when we do, we kind of just focus on making sure the words are right. And so we read very monotone. And so a lot of times when we read that, we're just thinking Gideon is like this. But if the Lord is with us, why has all that? But what's happening here? There's some snark in this. The attitude that Gideon is giving to God is more like, well, if the Lord is really with us, right? Why does this all happen? So he's doubting God here, which is kind of interesting because God has appeared to him. Usually, we would think that if God has appeared to you, you would have a little bit of respect, but actually no, right? Think about our lives. Think about all of us who have had these moments in our lives where we have seen God's power, we have seen God's love, we have seen God's faithfulness in our lives, and yet we still often doubt, right? So I don't think this, for Gideon to be kind of snarky with God and just doubting is actually unreasonable. Actually, this is actually how we are, right? And so we see that. We also see it in verse 15. And he says, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. Right? So he looks at himself as like a weak, insignificant person. So when God calls him to be in this judge, he's like, can I do it, right? And so we see fear and doubt right from the very beginning. But here's what's really cool, because if you're like, well, is that surprising? I have lots of fear and doubt in my life, so hey, thanks for the sermon, Pastor. That just made me feel even worse, right? No, that's not the point. The point is he has all this fear and doubt, and yet God meets Gideon where he's at. He's patient with Midian. In their conversation, there's no scolding at all, right? Look at in verse 14. This is after Gideon basically says, if you are really Lord, then why has all this happened to us? It says this. God says, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Like God's like, yeah, I just heard what you said. And I heard you doubt. I heard that you doubted me, and yet go, right? He's not scolding Gideon. He is just encouraging him. He's telling him to go. In verse 16, God says, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites. God is saying, yes, I know you're scared. I know you're scared. I'm not mad at you. I am going to be with you. And then verse 23 says, peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die. This is when Gideon realizes, oh my goodness, it's the angel of the Lord. Okay? And so God meets our fears and doubts with patience and encouragement. That's really important to remember, because I think a lot of us, especially if you've grown up in the church and have been a Christian for a long time, we know we're not supposed to be afraid. We know we're supposed to trust, and we know that, and yet it doesn't always happen. We still are scared, and we think that God is just going to be, have the attitude of like, come on. Like, how many times do I have to show my faithfulness? How many times? We think that that's how God is going to be, partly because that's how we are to other people. Right? But God is not like that. Right? God is patient every time we're scared. God is not like, kicking us in the butt and saying, come on, like, you don't be scared. God is saying don't be scared, but he's patient with us. Right? And so that's super important to remember, because if you live a faith where you think God is always disappointed at you, that is not going to help you be more faithful. That's just going to put you in more and more despair. And so know that in your fear and doubt, God is patient and he continues to speak words of encouragement. Okay? And then we get to verse 24 to 32. This is the later parts of chapter 6. And God, the first thing God commands Gideon to do is to tear down the altar to Baal, and to actually use that wood, tear down all that stuff, to build an altar to God. And Gideon obeys, right? And so, yay, good for you, Gideon. Like, you were scared, you did all, you're scared, you're doubting, but when God told you, hey, this is what I want you to do, he did it, right? But he does it at night. Does that at night so nobody can see. Right? He's like, okay, I gotta do this. If I do this at 3 p.m., all those Baal worshipers probably gonna kill me. So let me wait till the middle of the night. He does it, right? But of course, he still gets caught, right? So the next day, those Baal worshipers, they're like, they watch a lot of CSI, so they're all like, doing fingerprints. And I don't think they did fingerprints back then, but they figured out. They're like, it's Gideon, right? And so they want to kill Gideon. And here's an interesting thing. Okay, so Gideon's father, Joash, sticks up for Gideon naturally because it's his son, but he does it in an interesting way. In verse 30 to 31, it says, so the people are like, bring out your son, he must die, because he has broken down Baal's altar. But Joash replied, are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save him? Whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. No, this they say, whoever fights for him shall be put to death by morning. If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar, right? And so in Joash's response, there's two attitudes that's being reflected, I think, that we still have today. I think the first one is that Joash knew Baal wasn't real, right? I think deep down, Joash, who's not some holy, God-fearing person, he's a part of all this, kind of knows, like, all right, you tore down Baal's altar, not cool. Like Gideon, like you're not making friends here. But deep down, he knows, like, come on, guys, it's not really real. And so I think the first attitude is this. I think we often idolize things that we know won't satisfy us. I think in our lives, we often pursue things with a lot of effort that we know deep down, I don't think this is really going to satisfy us. I think the most common things might be, in our careers and relations, when we put all of our identities into those things, and we're like, I don't think this is going to work. Like this is what we do, though. This is our culture. This is what we do in America, right? And we do that. And so I think that's reflected here, where Joash doesn't actually believe in Baal. He just kind of goes along with the worship of Baal. And I think the second attitude, which I think is relevant today, is I think there are people who claim Christ but don't actually believe. Right? You see less of that in this part of the country because people don't like Christians, right? But in a part of the country where Christians are more, it's more of a culturally accepted and culturally helpful. You can be a part of the church and not actually really believe. And so you know how there's a thing that a lot of evangelists do, which is the old if you were to die today, where would you go? Right? And now I understand why they do that, because it is a very important question, right? But it's like, I'm not sure if that's actually the most helpful way to help somebody come to know Jesus. I think that question is not the best question to ask somebody who doesn't believe. I think it's actually a really good question for someone who already believes. Because I think there are a lot of Christians who deep down, I'm not sure if they actually believe, right? Do you actually believe that when you die, you will be saved? Do you actually believe that any of this is real? I think it's very easy for Christians who especially grow up in the church to just kind of do their thing, go to church, believe, and just not really think that deeply and ask themselves, wait, do I really, really believe? Okay. And so I think that question is really important to ask, right? Because I think a lot of us just are uncomfortable kind of asking that deep question for ourselves, because we don't know what the answer is, and we're kind of scared to ask. And so I think that's an important thing to just really ask ourselves, hey, I'm a Christian, I believe this stuff, kind of said the prayer, I might even got baptized, but really? And so I think that's a good question to just sit back and ask yourself. Okay. All right, so Gideon is called to tear down the altar and Baal's altar, and he does that, right? And then in verse 32 to 40, what we find is that, the Midianites are coming, right? This is their annual, I think the corn is about ready to be harvested. Let's go attack the Israelites, which I don't think they were growing corn. I'm just, putting American, Pilgrim days on that, right? But whatever they grow, right? So they're coming, right? And here's the really cool thing. In verse 34, I'm not going to read it. The Spirit of the Lord comes on Gideon, and he summons his people to fight. Remember, he's scared. Yeah, he did this one thing, tearing down the altar, that was good obedience, right? But that's like an individual thing. Now he's called to lead the Israelites. That's tough. So the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. He has, he gets this courage, and he does it. He does it, right? But here's the thing. He still has fear and doubt, and God is still patient with him, because at the end of the chapter you have the famous story of Gideon and the fleece, right? Where he's like, hey God, I really believe in you, I trust you, but can you just do this thing? I'm going to put this on the ground, fleece on the ground, and make sure it's wet, and then the ground is dry, and then the next day we'll reverse it. See, he wants to know for sure, right? So he asks God to test God, right? And so we see that you see, he's scared. He sees God. Okay, he obeys. And he's still kind of scared, but God, like the Spirit of God comes upon him, but he's still kind of scared. So like there's still fear there. And I think that's important because we often feel like when you have faith, it's just a straight line trajectory. The slope is always positive. But the reality is this: you will go through times of life where your faith is like, I really went like that. For you're seeing it from this angle, right? For you, it's like, yeah, woo! And then you're gonna have times where it dips. It goes all over, right? It's not a linear line. It's gonna be weird, and that's okay. That's what's happened with Gideon. It's like he has these moments, and it's just God is patient, and God is kind, and he's loving. He understands our fears and doubts will kind of be in there. Okay, so that's okay, right? So now we're in chapter 7. This is Gideon's 1%, right? So chapter 6 took a while. Chapter 7, I'm going to do it pretty quickly, right? So this is the other famous Bible story that you probably know of. This is where Gideon has 22,000 warriors, and God's like, it's a lot, don't need all that. And so he whittles it down to about 300, okay? And he's like, you only need 300 to defeat the Midianites. I love that 300, that's about a 99% reduction, which is really, it's just, for like numbers people, it's like almost nothing, like 99%, right? And then so he reduces down to 99%, reduces it by 99% from 22,000 to 300, and then you have some weird stuff happening. Okay, so Gideon then does a recon mission. He goes to the Midianite camp, and he hears these people talk, and there's this weird dream about a giant loaf of bread crashing to the Midianite camp, and then the other guy's like, oh, that can only mean that God is against us. And you're like, well, that's a weird dream, but that's a big jump there, big jump to go from that's a weird dream about bread to God is going to defeat us, right? But Gideon's like, oh, that's amazing, and then the final battle plan here is also really weird because it's not hey, we need better weapons, we need we need missiles here, what does Gideon do? Gideon, he goes to Home Depot, and then he goes to Michael's and gets torches and clay jars, he's not going to the stores you probably should go to if you're going to go to war, Bass Pro Shop or Cabela's where you can get guns and stuff. He goes to Michael's, right? And he does this thing and it works, right? They just surround the camp with 300 people, and they open they break the jar so the torches are going, and they just blow on their trumpets, and then the Midianites are like, they go in, they're confused. Some of them start killing each other. They all flee, and it works, right? And now some of us here who are more cynical and analytical, and it's like, that doesn't make sense. No, it doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. 300 people should not be able to, even if you scared them, right? Even if there was a dream, this shouldn't have worked, and that's the point. The point is that God saves the Israelites, not Gideon. All this is the point to, this is not about Gideon and his might or his strength or his military strategy. This is about how God is going to save the Israelites. And so now we get to chapter 8, because Gideon's flying high. He's obedient. He's got this big battle victory. He worshiped God, and all this is wonderful. And this one is Gideon's downfall. And this is but here we go. Okay? So Gideon has now gone from being scared to being brave and obedient. Things are going well. He even gives glory to God. Back in chapter 7, verse 15, this is after he hears the dream the Midianites had. It says, when Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. So he at this point, he understands where the real power is. It's not in him, it's in God, and he worships. And then things go off the rails. So in verse 1 to 21 in chapter 8, basically Gideon and his 300 men continue to pursue the Midianites, right? Just because that camp has now fled, and you got to finish the battle, and so they're still pursuing them, and they get to towns called Succoth and Peniel, right? And they're tired, right? There's a lot of running, there's a lot of cardio out there, and they're probably carrying swords and stuff, and so they're like, hey guys, we're chasing the Midianites. Can I get some Gatorade? And I get some bread, and can I get some supplies? We're tired. And the officials and the people there are just like, no. Because keep in mind, right, this is one battle here. And they're like, well, I mean, I don't know if are you really going to be able to defeat all of them, or is this just like one lucky battle? I don't know. And so they don't really trust you. They don't believe him. They're like, no, we're not going to give you any of that. We're not going to help you. And Gideon, he gets mad. He's like, oh, I'll be back. And so he does. So he defeats the Midianites, comes back, and just punishes these two towns. Right? He punishes in one town. He uses thorns and briars and whips all the men. Another town, he just kills all the men. And so remember, in the book of Judges, it's about what God does in spite of what people do. It's not about how everything is good and done well, right? God does not command this. God absolutely does not command this. This is Gideon in his growing arrogance, right? Oh, you doubt me? Okay, I'll be back, and does this terrible thing, right? And so Gideon is starting to kind of, again, go off the rails. And then we get to verse 22 to 27. I want to read 22 and 23 to you. It says, the Israelites, this is after the battle now, the Israelites said to Gideon, rule over us, you, your son and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon told them, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. And this is one of those things where it's like, oh, Gideon, oh, good job. Yeah. But this is like politician Gideon here. He's just saying this. He does not mean it at all, right? And so when he's given this opportunity to rule by the people, he takes it. And how do we know this? How do we know what's in Gideon's heart, that he doesn't actually mean the Lord will rule over you? Well, we find out, or two big things. We find out in verse 31, it says, his concubine who lived in Shechem also bore him a son whom he named Abimelech. This is obviously later, right? And you're like, well, what does that have to do with it? Well, the problem is this. The name Abimelech means my father is king. So he's saying, oh, guys, I'm not your king. No. God is your king. And here's my son Abimelech, whose name is my father is king, right? Dad's king, right? And so it's like, oh, and you're like, well, maybe he means, God the Father. It's like, no, it's not. But even if that were the only thing, maybe, right? But later on, Gideon tells people well, hey, you know what? You don't just give me some of your gold and stuff. And what does he do with it? In verse 27 it says, Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. And so the ephod is something that only the high priest can wear. And so Gideon makes this thing that he's not supposed to make, and his family basically starts to idolize it. It becomes a snare to them. All of Israel starts to worship it, right? And so he is really taking on this I am king. I am not just king, but also high priest kind of position here. And so we see, this is where it's it's so sad. So Gideon starts, remember, the first thing he does in his quote-unquote career as a judge, right? The first thing he does is tear down an altar to Baal, right? Tear down this symbol of idol worship. And then he ends by just bringing the Israelites right back into worship of an idol with this ephod. And so it's just like, oh, what does this mean for us today, right? Does this mean that we're all going to like do great things and just crash? No. What this means for us today is this. We got to know insecurity leads to arrogance. Right? Or another way to think about it is fear and timidity leads to arrogance. And yes, even timid people can be arrogant. I think if we like kind of sit back and think to like ourselves and just people around us, there are plenty of people who will be very quiet and shy and never speak up, but they're sitting there with a lot of judgment and arrogance, thinking, like, look at the rest of these people here, bunch of peasants, like you can be quiet and still be incredibly arrogant, right? So, but fear and timidity, insecurity, it leads to arrogance, and we cannot truly live God's holiness this way. It's just, you can't. I mean, you can make it appear on the outside, but you cannot live God's holiness that way, and you cannot lead that way. All of you here will at one point in your life be a leader to some kind of group, whether it's your family or at work where you have employees, all that kind of stuff. Like, everybody's going to have that. And you cannot lead well. You cannot lead in a godly way when you have this insecurity in you, which will lead to arrogance, right? And here's the thing. Insecurity, that's not an uncommon trait. That's like all of us. All of us are going to deal with insecurity in our lives, okay? All of us, that's like everyone. And so this is important. It's not like, oh, well, okay, those people deal with that, so I don't have to worry about this. Right? We're all going to deal with it. So insecurity leads to arrogance. And here's the thing. So we deal with insecurity by keeping our eyes on God. We got to take our eyes off of ourselves, right? Off of our own abilities and who we think we are, and we've got to put them on God. There's this famous hymn, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus, and there's a line that goes, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Right? And so the question for us is, what are your things of earth? Right? What are those things that you know are not going to really satisfy your soul, that are not going to give you real joy? What are those things for you? And then the last thing is this. You will have true joy, peace, and contentment when you turn your eyes on Jesus. Right? A lot of us we know that, but we keep our eyes on the things of this world, keep our eyes on material things and all that stuff that the world goes after. Right? You will have true peace, joy, and contentment when you turn your eyes on Jesus, because those things will start to fade away. And so it's all about our focus, from what to who, and the who is Jesus. Let's pray. God, I thank you